And many thanks to all of you in our audience tonight for coming out on a dreary evening to join us for this truly fantastic program. My name's Jay Cook, and I'm a professor of U.S. Cultural History at the University of Michigan. I also have the honor of serving as the University of Michigan Ann Arbor Director of Research for the Inclusive History Project, a major university-wide research and public engagement initiative through the U of M President's Office and the National Center for Institutional Diversity. As some of you may know, the IHP was launched in July of 2023 and now includes 12 major project sites across our 3 U of M campuses, including the important multi-year project on the shifting experiences of U of M Jewish students, faculty, staff, and administrators, which produced tonight's event. If this is your very first IHP program, or if you're entirely new to the IHP, welcome. Please visit our digital platform to get a fuller sense of the truly remarkable range of research, teaching, and public engagement efforts that the IHP is sponsoring and leading for the University of Michigan. Simply put, the Inclusive History Project seeks to offer a more robust and comprehensive history of the University of Michigan that is broad, diverse, empirically grounded, and fully attentive to the questions of inclusion and exclusion over time. Our work to tell this more than 200-year history of the University of Michigan and its global impacts necessarily stretches across all disciplines, schools, and colleges, as well as all 3 of our U of M campuses and Michigan Medicine. In addition to the aforementioned project on Jewish experiences at U of M, about which you will learn much more in a moment, we now have multidisciplinary projects, research teams, and numerous courses up and running on Native American land in the making of U of M, the complex histories of African American students, music, dance, theater, and politics at Hill Auditorium, the history of University of Michigan athletics in all of its many facets, and U of M's deep involvements in the colonial Philippines, among many, many others. If any of this sounds interesting to you, please sign up for our IHP newsletters and other forms of digital connectivity. We're really eager to hear from you and engage with a wide variety of communities connected to this remarkable university. Before we begin tonight, I want to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan. This was offered ceremonially through the treaty at the foot of the rapids, so that, as it states in Article 16 of this important treaty, some of their children may be educated. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their manifold contributions to this university are renewed and reaffirmed. If you'd like to learn more about this history of Native American dispossession, ceded treaty lands, and the transformation of indigenous land into fungible assets, which quite literally built this university, please visit the homepage of our foundational 1817 project, which offers powerful new research on this history. Let me also thank our generous sponsors for tonight's event. These include, beyond the Inclusive History Project, the Jewish Communal Leadership Program, the Office of the Vice President for Student Life, the Jean and Samuel Frankel Center for Judaic Studies, the Department of American Culture, and the Department of History. Finally, please be sure to visit the homepage for the IHP project site responsible for tonight's event, entitled Outsiders, Insiders, Radicals, and Reformers, A History of Jews at the University of Michigan. Led by my U of M colleagues, Dr. Carla Goldman and Dr. Deborah Dash Moore, this IHP project site traces the diverse experiences of Jewish students, faculty, and administrators at U of M, exploring their trajectories from outsiders to insiders and sometimes back again across much of the past 100 years. Tonight, we turn to the experiences of Jewish U of M students in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and above all, to questions of food, culture, and identity. Please join me in welcoming Carla Goldman, Ruth Reichl, Joan Nathan, Ari Weinzweig.
Thank you, Jay. I'm Carla Goldman, and really want to welcome you all here. I know there's been a lot of excitement about this evening. We're excited to have gotten here. And I also want to thank, along with Jay, our co-sponsors, and I'll just mention that if you look at your front of your program, I definitely want to include the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Not sure if we're allowed to mention that now, but who have, I'll just say, have been wonderful supporters of our efforts here to address anti-Semitism and to highlight the vibrancy of Jewish life at the University of Michigan. I'd also like to thank Jennifer Junkenmeyer-Kahn and Kennedy Clark, and especially Megan Bernard, who has, you have no idea how much has gone into allowing this evening to happen, and we're very grateful to be here. So there has been a ton of excitement in anticipation of this conversation, not only because we brought together this amazing trio, all of them indispensable shapers of and guides to the possibilities of food, words, and community, not only because they are all respected, revered, and influential, even heroic to many, right? But also because they're all alumni of the University of Michigan. Amazing. So this evening is a little different. These people speak all the time about their work and accomplishments, but we're asking them to share with us a glimpse of their own youthful experience at the University in Ann Arbor and at the University of Michigan, to give us some insight into how their student years shaped their identities and worldviews, and in turn, how their campus experiences led to their stunning careers and endeavors, right? Stunning. I had other words, but I was like, stunning. Stunning is where we're going. And I want to mention that the Inclusive History Project and the Jewish Communal Leadership Program, which I direct, are the chief sponsors of this program, not because we're experts on food, but because we want to understand how Jewish identity played into student experience during their time on campus, and to enrich our sense of campus in general, of its culture, texture, and impact, and the impact of being in Ann Arbor during the years when you were students. So rather than taking what would be an extremely long time to be able to introduce these people adequately, I'll refer you to the short introductions in the program so that we can give the time to the conversation instead. I'm sure that's okay with these folks. So let's start. Let's start with the question of what brought you as students to the University of Michigan. What stands out for you in terms of what you found here, and what was different than what you experienced. So a little bit about sort of how you came to be here, and sort of one kind of overall impression of the impact on that. Joan's looking at me, so I'm going to invite you to start. She was also the earliest arrival.
Okay, well, I actually wanted to go to one of the Seven Sisters in those days. But my father he was in the thermostat business, and he would come, I don't know why, to Detroit, and he said, University of Michigan is the most cost-effective school. And he thought it was a great school, so that's where I went. And when I remember I was the first person from my school, from my high school, to come here, and I remember my advisor.
Where were you coming from?
In Providence, Rhode Island. And my advisor, Classical High School, if anyone's from Providence, my advisor said, why do you want to go west of Albany? Why would you? Anyway, so I got here, and I can't remember what, anyway, and I went to Mosher Hall, and they put me with, I have to tell you, I had a Jewish roommate from Miami who wrote to me and said, if you're getting up early in the morning, I hope you'll dress outside the room. And I thought, anyway, needless to say, we weren't exactly friends. And I thought, why are they putting me with another Jewish student? That was sort of interesting. Did you have that happen to you?
No, I did not. I did not have a Jewish roommate.
It's an important question, actually, about whether that was a practice here, and people had different
It
experiences.
might have
but, yeah.
stopped after, I never wrote to anybody, but I just could not, I still have her letters, and I thought, oh my God. Anyway, I mean, she was very nice, but, and I, as far as, I mean, I loved being here. I never went to a football game, or one. But I did feel a little bit different because every weekend, the students, the Jewish students or students from Detroit, which were the majority, a lot of them, would go home most weekends. And so the out-of-state students were a little bit alone. So I don't know why I joined a sorority. I just know that when I called my parents to tell them that I was going to be in SDT, my mother, there was a silence. And then my mother wrote me this letter, which is in my memoir, saying something like, I'm glad that you got in because you wanted to, but I hope you won't forget about other people. Don't forget, this was the period of civil rights. Treat everybody well. And something about, but you'll learn to be dainty and go to tea parties or something. Anyway, but I just liked opening the world. I mean, I never went to Hillel, which was right next door to SDT. I knew I was Jewish, but I loved the history of art classes. I loved what I learned here. And I think that my real awareness of being Jewish happened a little bit late. I mean, it was always there, but when I went my junior year abroad really made me realize that I was a Jew in so many ways. And I think it led me to want, I mean, I always like to eat, but that was...
Okay, well, yes, we'll come back to that. Yeah, thank you, Joan. That's great. And what year did you graduate?
65, and then I got my master's in 66.
Thank you.
From here.
Ruth, you want to?
Well, the reason I ended up coming here is pretty prosaic. My parents told me I could have $100 to apply for colleges, and the University of Michigan was free. And so I didn't even think about it. I just sent off this application in October and was accepted. And so then I thought, okay, I've got my fallback school, and applied to Ivy Leagues. In retrospect, I mean, for a long time after I left here, I kept saying that I felt like I didn't get a very good education because I came in '64, and basically all I did was politics for, 4 years of, the first sit-ins, civil rights, and it took me a long time to realize that I was so lucky that I did not get into these Ivy League colleges I wanted to go to, because what I got here was something I would never have gotten if I had gone to one of those Eastern schools. I was lucky enough to, my roommate was Black, and because of Loli, I mean, she was here on what was then called an Opportunity Award. I don't know if they still give those out, but it was basically for poor people from Detroit, and she got money for clothes. It was incredible, but she had been given a mentor who was somebody who had come from the South, a Black guy who came up as an athlete and had gotten a master's in psychology and was her mentor. And through the two of them, I ended up having mostly Black friends for the whole time that I was here, and had experiences that I just never would have had anywhere else. I mean, one of them was Mac really loved the blues and knew a lot about him. I mean, he is a wonderful person, and they're both still very close friends. And Mac and I drove to Chicago to a blues bar in the south side of Chicago, and we parked, and as we were getting out of the car, 2 policemen came by and said, "We don't want any race riots here." we're going to go drive around the block and you better be gone when we come back. And we drove back to Ann Arbor. It was the kind of experiences that were shocking, eye-opening, important, I then later, I graduated, stayed in Ann Arbor working for a year to get in-state tuition, and then went to graduate school. And went, I have a master's in art history, but I knew with that go-round, I got to know all these people in the art school. And Ann Arbor in the 60s was the center of a whole art world. There was this group called the Once Group. I hung out at the Ware's house all the time. George Manupelli started the first experimental film festival, I think, in the country. George was a close friend. Padalesco who almost invented performance art, was later my roommate and still probably my closest friend. And through the Once Group, I got to know Andy Warhol and Robert Rauschenberg. The Warhol people all came to Ann Arbor. Some of them stayed at our place. We went to New York, and I got to know all of these, artists who were changing the world. That's what being at the University of Michigan gave me. And I was stupid enough to leave here and say, for a long time, well, I really didn't get a very good education.
And Ruth, since where were you coming from?
I came from New York, and I grew up in a New York that, my family was not religious at all, but we lived in a very Jewish world. My father was a book designer. Publishing was totally Jewish. My parents didn't have friends who weren't Jewish. I didn't realize that. But when I came to Ann Arbor, it was probably, I didn't live in a Jewish world anymore. It was a completely different world. And that, for me, was very rich. It was a world of totally different experiences. And really, all of the people who were important to me when I was here are still really important to me in the life I still live.
Amazing. And what year did you graduate?
I graduated in '68 and got my master's in '70.
And you mentioned to me before, I think people are interested, what was the tuition?
Okay. As an undergrad, out-of-state tuition was $2,000 a year. And I stayed out of school for a year working to get in-state tuition, which I believe was $500 a year.
That's amazing.
And just a note on behalf of the Ivy League schools and the Seven Sisters, they're probably not happy that they didn't admit you. I think they would have loved to have you, but maybe you wouldn't have become the same person.
I wouldn't be the same me. I definitely would not be.
Amazing. All right, hard act to follow.
I don't think I can follow that. Wow. You had a much more interesting experience than I did. I was just thinking, listening to us, that if there's any high school career counselors in the audience, this is like the death knell for the work, since none of us had a clue what we were doing, and here we are on the panel, which is okay. It's not a bad thing.
Now?
Well, I think that's the point, but it goes against the belief that there's a really obvious answer that you're supposed to be able to figure out, and goes more into just go forward and figure it out as you go. But yeah, I had a different experience. I am from Chicago. I grew up in a very Jewish family. I went to Solomon Schechter Day School till 8th grade with the same 13 people. and I was the first graduating class from Solomon Schechter in Chicago. And then I wanted to get as far from that as I could, so I went to public high school with 2,700 people in Skokie. And then when it was time for college, I don't know, I just needed somewhere to, like, it wasn't really an option not to, like, not going to college was like, yeah, like, I mean, it wasn't really something I could even imagine. And then I didn't really know where to go. And my mother had gone to Madison, so I applied there, and I applied to Washington University in St. Louis. And I went there, but it was too small, and I wanted to go somewhere big. And most of my friends from Chicago were going to Illinois, so I didn't want to go there. So I ended up here. And I knew one person who became my roommate because I knew him. And I lived in Alice Lloyd in the pilot program.
We'll come back. if you
And
wanna
here
add
we
anything.
are.
Here we are. So you all addressed this a bit, but if you want to sort of add to it in this space about your sense of Judaism, Jewish identity growing up, you addressed that, but sort of how that landed when you arrived here, if there's anything you want to add to what you said, like how present it was for you, or not present. And I think, as you were saying, Joan, a little bit like your Paris experience had a great impact on that. But
Well, my father was German, and we have a lot of similarities. And he came here in 1929, and he had a German accent, but I grew up first when I was, I guess, 3, we moved from Providence to Larchmont, New York, and then back to Providence. And I grew up in a Reformed Jewish home. They were just starting a synagogue in Larchmont, mostly started by the German Jews that lived there. And I grew up during the civil rights era, and that was what was important to me, and it was important to me when I came here as well. Judaism, Reform Judaism in those days, a girl never got bat mitzvah, there was nothing. But we did have Friday night dinners. I mean, we did, and my mother was from New York, so, she really wanted us to have that. But we got, we weren't kosher, and I'm still not kosher. But there wasn't a lot of Judaism at home. I mean, holidays, but that was it. It wasn't like Solomon Schechter. And I didn't have to rebel against anything, really. And, and I came here, and I guess joining a Jewish, but we didn't have, it wasn't kosher, it wasn't, it was a Jewish sorority, that was it. But there wasn't any, really felt, I knew people that were, I've always thought, this person's Jewish, that person is not Jewish, but I never.
So Ruth said that your friends really weren't Jewish here. What was your experience? What you were
mixed. I mean, I had a really good, actually, black friend who happened to have lived in Providence, but went to a different school from me, and she was very involved in civil rights. And so I got involved in doing things for SDS and thinking about going to the South. She went to Selma for a year. And she said her mother, they lived in Detroit at the time, her mother was furious with her for doing that, just because she was scared. But I didn't have the guts to do it. I just didn't want to, but my heart was with them. And that's what I thought about, were civil rights. And then, of course, I mean, this was the place to be in the 60s. I agree with you. And if I had gotten in, I got waitlisted at Barnard. But if I'd gotten into one of those Seven Sisters schools, I wouldn't be the same person either. But I mostly remember the courses that I took. And in graduate school, studying Proust, then I realized a lot about his Judaism. And that's what I wrote my thesis on. But it was opening the world to me. And it wasn't necessarily a Jewish world.
You mentioned that sort of when you were in Paris, it attuned you a lot more to sort of the power of Jewish observance and food and meaning. And I'm wondering, after you came back here, after that year, were you then more aware of sort of the absence of that?
Well, I was aware of Judaism. I was also aware of Algerians. because there were a lot of Algerians in Paris at that time. What made me really aware of Judaism when I was in Paris was going to Jewish homes for Shabbat or for holidays. Shabbat was like Friday night dinner. Whoever used the word Shabbat in those days, I don't think anybody did. But anyway, I did go there for holidays, and then I realized the universality of Judaism, or that Jews were everywhere, and it was sort of a different theme in each country, different food, like onions were like, they were tiny, 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 sauteed before you made chicken or chicken soup, which makes a little bit of a different taste. We Jews cut them up bigger, at least my mother did, cut them bigger. And
In the U.S.
It was a different flavor.
Yeah.
But and that really stunned me more than anything else, and that's what carried me through from the rest of my life. And I came back here, and I was young. I was thinking about, what am I going to do after college? That's what my senior year, I really was in a fog. What am I going to do?
You were both here at such a critical, changing time, as we were discussing before. You don't realize you're living in a really historical moment, but we probably don't have time for it today. But even like the changing sort of rules for women on campus was happening as you were here, and maybe we can get back to that a little bit. How did you carry forward?
Oh, how did I grow up? Well,
No,
I grew up with the opposite, an overdose. In a very conservative family where, yes, they only knew Jewish people other than the neighbors on the block, but they weren't friends with them. It's just that's who they knew. Where we went to shul every Saturday, no questions allowed. And Friday night, yes, Shabbos dinner that my grandmother, we used to go to my grandmother's and she would cook, and then later she would come to our house. So I grew up with all of that and spoke Hebrew, and I'm not at home, but I took 8 years of Hebrew, so I had all of that. Emma Goldman, who Deborah knows, who I've written a lot about, said every child is an anarchist at heart, and I was. And so when I tried to tell them that I didn't want to do that, they weren't interested in hearing me, and the not uncommon belief that, you'll figure it out and you'll be fine later. But of course, it kind of worked in reverse in a sense. Although in many ways I, ended up with a lot of the intellectual and ethical traditions, I guess, in a very roundabout way. But when I was here was 10 years later, and it was already like, it was cool history, but there was already people were saying like, it's pretty much over. And now, like, I think you could say it's very different, obviously, but it's half a century later. But when I was here, it was already ending. I graduated in 1978, somebody asked before.
Yes, right. Given that you got a lot from your family growing up, and you were sort of pushing against it, while you were in college, how did it...
Well, it's that weird thing where, like, it was not a part of my life, really, but then there's the other part of it, so there's like the religious part of being Jewish, but then there's like the cultural piece there's this whole piece of Jewish tradition, which isn't the piece that gets talked about as Jewish tradition, but it's Emma Goldman and Gustav Landauer and, all these people who were on the periphery pushing back. And the truth is there were probably as many of them as there were of the other ones, but they don't get written into history in the same way. And so, I wouldn't have, in the same way Joan wouldn't have said, or Ruth wouldn't have said she got a good education, like I wouldn't have thought of it as a Jewish education, but I was in the Labadi collection, which is right over here, which, like 1/18 of 1% of U of M students ever go into, and double that know that it even exists. But it's an amazing collection of anarchist and radical literature. So I used to go up there and study, and like who, was I studying? Alexander Berkman, Emma Goldman, Joseph Ischel, all these people who were Jewish anarchists, so in a sense it sort of ended up there. I did go my junior year to Israel, to Hebrew University, which, again, I ended up on the periphery of who, so most of my friends, I had a lot of friends who were Arabs and et cetera, but I also had professors who had been in Soviet Union who were expelled and now we're teaching there. So that was like awesome. And it's hard for me to parse today, but my Hebrew was good enough that I was taking classes in the regular university, listening to lectures in Hebrew and taking notes in English, and I knew what was going on. So,
And if, like they did, who would you describe who your friends were?
my friends here,
Here, while you were in college?
I'm a total introvert. I mean, I had some friends. I have some that I'm still friends with, not a lot. Some were Jewish, some weren't. One turned out to be David Allen Greer. Well, he was David Allen Greer, who's now famous, but at the time I lived in Alice Lloyd, and he lived in Mosher, Jordan, and we were friends. So some were Jewish, some weren't, but it wasn't like I wasn't like going to Hillel or any of the things like Joan said. I mean,
And I just,
I was telling my mother I was going to get her to stop nagging me, but
I can remember I had an Egyptian boyfriend my freshman or sophomore year, and my father wrote me this long letter because he thought about the Suez Canal and Nasser, and was telling me that Egyptians really didn't like Jews, and I thought, well, this guy's a nice guy, and but the beauty, one of the beauties I thought of Michigan were all the foreign students that were here then.
yeah.
And during these times right now, I was thinking the beauty of America was in all the people that we have had in colleges and universities and grad schools that have gone back to their country and really made the world a better place. I mean, it's unbelievable. Anyway, that I shouldn't say.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's one of the things that I've thought about. But I remember that my father, who was, I thought, very liberal, and he writes this letter to me. It was shocking.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, in hindsight, like a lot of my professors who were teaching in the history department were Bill Rosenberg, Art Mendel, so there was a lot of people who were Jewish teaching, again, radical Jewish tradition, I guess, in hindsight. And I just studied it because I liked it. I mean,
I mean, I would say, that the household I grew up in was, so secular. I mean, we didn't have Friday night dinner. We never had a Seder at our house. I mean, we didn't go to temple. But there was I think, to sort of supplement that, there was a lot of discussion about how you live a moral life in the world if you are. I mean, my father was a devout atheist. I mean, he really, he was very serious about that and really hated organized religion. I mean, not surprising for someone who came to the United States in 1926 from Germany at the age of 26. But to replace that, there was this sense that Jews have a morality and that you have to figure out how you live in this world without religion. I mean, if you are not going to believe that there is some being who is making you be good, you have to figure this out for yourself. And I feel like I really got that. I mean, it's how when I think about Judaism, that's what I think of. I don't think about it as a religion, but as a real commandment to live a good life and be moral in this world. And that if you are going to erase religion, you have to replace it with something else.
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
I was just going to say, well said.
Well said. Both of you mentioned sort of the politics, Students for a Democratic Society, Tom Hayden's Basement, which I just read about, actually. And that movement here, there were a lot of Jewish students who were very involved in it, but not necessarily. Alan Haber just came to my class last week, who's the founder of SDS in many ways, but not consciously as Jews, in a way, right? Like, it's sort of, when we asked him, you look around that room, he's like, well, yeah, a lot of them were Jewish, but ... we talked about this before, was that a coincidence? Is that something, as you were in those spaces, that you were thinking about people's identities apart from, you know, being foreign students or being African American or white students? Was it?
Thinking, I mean, it's just the
Were you aware?
I was aware, but, you know, I forget what the watchword of the Jewish faith, something, love, mercy, and justice, or something, and walk humbly with thy God.
Yeah.
That was on the Temple Bethel, or Larchmont Temple. It was, you know, right there, and it was just something that we
Love,
learned
mercy,
in
and
Hebrew
justice.
school.
Yeah.
We didn't even call it Sunday school.
I
mean,
went to
what?
day school, we didn't have Sunday school.
But that was something that, you know,
I
I
didn't know about
learned
that.
just about, that's what just carried me through, was just decency. I mean, that I've tried to do in my life, but I didn't really think about Jewish, non-Jewish. It wasn't, when I was here, it wasn't a big deal for me.
Right. And I had that same sense from you, but I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, no.
More so for her.
Yeah, I mean, so the people I knew in SDS and politics were, actually most of them weren't Jewish either. Bill Ayers, I mean, not a Jew.
Okay. What about the food in your college
Then
days?
or now? Oh,
Yeah, then.
Well,
What was your experience of Ann Arbor food, or?
you have better experiences.
Okay, so my three most seminal food experiences were, one, in my first year here, I worked in the cafeteria, the soda shop at Cousins Hall, and we spent a lot of time trying to figure out who could manage to give people the most food for their money, you know, the biggest ice cream cones. And I also worked in the libraries, and the minimum wage was $1 an hour. So I worked 20 hours a week shelving books. I made $20. And then a boyfriend told me he had just gotten a job at this new restaurant called La Seine, the fanciest restaurant that ever opened in Ann Arbor, and that he was making $35 on every night and waiting tables there. And I went and got a job as a waitress at La Seine, which was how I fell in love with the restaurant business. I mean, it was the most amazing restaurant. It was a dream. It didn't last. It lasted a year and a couple of months, but I met restaurant people and loved the work and loved the money, and, you know, waitressed the whole time I was in Ann Arbor.
How was the food there? What kind of food was it?
It was a very French restaurant. The chef was from the Four Seasons in New York. The grill chef was from the London Chop House. The woman who trained me to be a waitress, I mean, I did speak fluent French. She was French, and she taught me to bone fish and how to flambe food. I mean, it was classic French food, served on Limoges china with Waterford crystal. We had a silver chandelier that was apparently, I mean, from an auction and had been touted as having belonged to the Duke of Windsor. It was really a dream of a
Why
restaurant.
didn't it last?
It was, you know, on that main street in Ann Arbor. Main Street. And it didn't last because no sane restaurateur uses Limoges china. It all breaks. The crystal shatters. You don't do that. It's crazy. You don't invest that kind of money. Apparently, they invested $200,000 just in 1965 money. That's a lot of money. But while it lasted, It was wonderful. And we became a group of people together. I mean, we went out to drink after every shift. We had parties on off days. We had barbecues. It was amazing. One of the other things is the people in the once group were amazing cooks. Joe Ware went out and he got morels in morel season and would bring them back and cook them. And you could always drop in over there and there would be something wonderful to eat. And there was something else I was going to tell you, and now I can't remember what it was. Oh, I will tell you what it was. Lolita and I, after our first year, moved into the dorms that had, you could cook. It was 2 bedrooms with a kitchen in between, and you cooked for yourselves. And that was great because we went to the farmers markets. We were cooking for ourselves, and the food in the dorms was terrible. And we would have people over for dinner, and then we moved into our own apartments and had big meals. And so just cooking was a very big part of my life in Ann Arbor. And when I was not in the year between being in school and not, I joined a co-op, and I ended up being the person who made the menus for when everybody was cooking. Was how I learned how to write recipes, actually.
Well, what I remember most is, first of all, there was no Jewish food that I ever even thought of, or even restaurants. I mean, I was thinking Hebel we would go to if our parents were coming. We'd go to Detroit to the Greek restaurants. I remember that. But even then, I learned about Star Bakery in Detroit and other places later, and when I became a food writer. The Levin brothers one was a senator, one was a congressman, they were totally into the food of Detroit. And they're the ones who really taught me about that when I lived in Washington. But when I was in Ann Arbor, there are 2 things that I remember. One was there was a line at Drake's. I love Drake's. And I especially liked their sticky buns. But more than that, I craved the icing on top of the cakes. And when you went to pay, they'd have all these cakes in front of you, and with knives they cut them, but they left some. And I just wanted to lick the knives, but I never. That's one thing I absolutely remember. And I remember there was somebody from AE Phi, Susie Rosenfeld, who was Jewish, from New York City, she said, but somebody else here was saying that wasn't true. She told me that a man came into Central Park and took a picture of her, and she was the Gerber baby on the Gerber baby foods. Anyway, she worked as a waitress there. And I thought, oh my God, a Jewish girl working as a waitress? And I kind of was jealous of her, but I was like, again, I didn't do it. But I did work at Olson's bookstore, wasn't it? What was it called?
They say Ulrich. Was it Ulrich?
Yeah, right, Ulrich's bookstore. Okay. Just to be able to pay for the books that I got, because my parents just didn't, at that point in their lives, didn't have the cash for me. So I worked there. But the other thing is, I never lived in a co-op, but at my senior year, I lived with, I guess a lot of you are from Detroit, Sarah Marwell from Marwell's bookstore, and another friend, Barbara Schwartz. We lived, I think, near South Forest Street in an apartment, and that's when I went to the to the farmers market. And I remember at the time thinking, I could find yogurt there, because yogurt wasn't a big thing in 1965. And it was in a glass bottle, and I remember that I used to love eating that with putting a tiny bit of sugar on top and feeling the crystals of the sugar on your tongue, and then it was just delicious. But also, I forget what there was a health food store, and but it wasn't like health food stores today or like Zingerman's Deli, but it was just, everything looked awful. It was brown rice, and nothing was, but that's what, I do remember the health food store, that I do remember. But we would come back and we would, Mastering the Art of French Cookery was out in '61. So was Craig Claiborne's book. So we started cooking from that in our house, and it was just so much fun to do for our friends and other people. But I'm sure your food was more sophisticated than ours was in those days.
They were way ahead of me. Well, I grew up, I have a pamphlet I did a few years ago on food and philosophy, and the first line is something like, once every week or so, my mother cooked us fish sticks. So unlike Joan, whose books I've read and written about, and, so I kind of know her whole childhood. Like, I grew up on Kraft macaroni and cheese, Mrs. Paul's fish sticks, Pop-Tarts, Tang, Nestle's Quick. Other than my grandmother coming on Friday night to make the exact same meal for my entire first 18 years of my life. All that changed was Jell-O or fruit cocktail was different for dessert. So I had zero culinary background. So when I had nobody in my family was in business. So I paid no attention to either of those the whole time I was in school. So I don't know, we ate in the dorm. We ate at Pizza Bob's. I didn't have a car, so, and, I think, I don't know, I'm going to say before climate change kicked in, it was a lot colder here in the winter. I don't know if that's really true. But, so walking from that side of campus to the Del Rio, there's only 2 weeks that it's not freezing here when you're in, the school year is so short, because it's over in mid-April, right? So there was 2 weeks you could walk, but to walk from this side of campus to the Del Rio in December was, it was I felt like Dr. Zhivago, going across campus. So, we didn't really go out that much. Order pizza or whatever.
Del Rio, a restaurant? What was that?
Yeah.
Sorry,
Dude.
we're
Not a Jewish restaurant, but it was a restaurant.
What about
Old Town, Del Rio, all those.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I have another big food Ann Arbor memory, which is that in about 1968, Hillary Amos, who was Martin Amos's mother, and she married a professor here, and she and another woman opened a fish and chip shop called Lucky Jim's. And Hilly was a friend and one of the funniest people who ever walked the earth. And that was a kind of great, for me, Ann Arbor food experience. I don't know how long it lasted. Hilly left.
It lasted a long time.
Did it?
Yeah.
What about Red's Right Spot?
So
Wasn't it an all-night journey?
I've been emailing with the guy who worked there. He was a cook there, because the new chapbook I have out is called Life Lessons I Learned from Being a Line Cook, which is how I still think of myself. And I do. And anyway, he connected with me, and I didn't really know about it because it was before my time, but he shared a lot of stories about working there when he was younger. Bill Haney, yeah.
So, we're going to move towards questions in a little bit.
Yeah.
Ari, you mentioned none of us knew what the heck we were going to become, right? And
I definitely didn't.
But so now, this is an opportunity, to sort of reflect on that time and the influences that shaped you. So, for the University of Michigan brochures, if you think about it now, what were the things that you think you took from here that is ultimately, got you where you were going, I guess? What are because we've heard, definitely sort of opening the world in this way, and I'm wondering, maybe a little bit more specific about what were those things that, sort of carried you on?
Okay, I think the one really important professor in my life who I haven't spoken about tonight was Milton Cohen, who was in the art school. and he taught light and motion. And Doug and I ended up going and Milton moved to Crete, and we went and lived with him for a while in Crete, and he took us to Italy, and everything about his class, and I worked for Milton when I was an undergraduate, and he taught me to really look at the world, to really experience everything. And he taught me that not to look for the big things, but to pay attention to the little ones, that the great moments of grace in life they're all around you all the time. And it has probably been the most important lesson of my life, that it's the thing that if you're not paying attention, you miss it. And if you miss that, you miss everything that really matters in life.
It's a good lesson.
Now you have to get applause.
I guess there are several things that I learned, but one from a professor. I took courses with Michel Benamou, who taught symbolism, and he was, I think, from a Moroccan Jewish family, and that was like a whole other thing for me. But he taught me about symbolism, and to look at symbolism in what you were reading, and also the symbols of food. And that's something that stayed with me forever. But I think really being here in a different environment, just opening up the world to me, that was really the most important thing. Michigan has become dearer to me as I've gotten older. And what I learned here, and just listening to younger people that have been here has been very encouraging to make me remember what I got from the school, because I think at that time, if you didn't get married when you were 22 or you fell in love, I didn't fall in love. That was like, what? Where are you going to go? What are you going to do? That was a big deal, and you were really worried about that. I don't think that helped you very much, but
No, that's great.
Well, there's, I'm just reflecting. So there's a not Jewish woman named Carol Sanford who just passed away in December. She was like 85, who writes some amazing stuff about business, and somehow I never heard of her until last July when somebody given all the business books I've read and taught. But anyway, I've learned a lot from her stuff. I read all her 6 books in the last 6 months, and one of the things that I learned from her is it's something we've been doing for decades, but I never thought about it. And she says that most mainstream businesses, they're all trying to do what she calls direct work. Like they're looking for, like, you post this at this time and it gets you this sales result. You hire in this way and it increases your productivity, and she's like, it's all flawed. It doesn't work. And that the answers are in what she calls indirect work. And then I was like, oh yeah, that's what we do. Like we teach classes on visioning, on self-management, on beliefs, on hope, like stuff that there's no direct, you can't like say we teach this class on beliefs and sales go up 2.8%. Like it doesn't work like that. And, so everything I learned is like that. Like it wasn't, and people like I always have said it for me, but you could say it for these 2 amazing women too, is I'm like the poster child for liberal arts, because you could take a history degree and look what happened, and so like I still love the history, and that's what we do, so our definition of quality food, which we formalized in 1991, so whatever that was, 9 years after we opened, is full flavored and traditional food. So all we really do is traditional food, and we teach about the history of all the food. And what I learned is, like, I'm fascinated, like my e-news today, which is in your inbox, is about the Serbian student protest movement that's going on right now. Like, many of you know what it is, but it's amazing. Anyway, but it's just like these things that are fascinating, but nobody else is paying attention to, right? And with the food, so I love that obscure history, but most people I learned are way more interested when they're eating it. And so in the context of the Ojibwe people, like, you know, most people in the United States have heard of wild rice, but 98% of their experience of wild rice is Uncle Ben's, which isn't even wild. It's not even commercial wild rice. It's like 2% commercial wild rice. So when we serve it, and then I can tell people like the role of manuman of really wild, I call it really wild rice, because 90% of what's sold is cultivated. It's not wild anymore. And then you get into the history of how it played out in the culture of the Ojibwe people and how it was this prominent thing of economics, of religion, of ritual, of seasonality and everything. And then they're like, wow, this is so interesting. But if I tried to get them to come to an hour talk on the history of wild rice, like 2 people would come. So it's really an amazing way to bring it alive. And like the sweet potato fries at the Roadhouse, which is like probably the biggest selling thing, come out of the Gullah tradition. And 2% of people who come in know who the Gullah people are, but then I get to tell them it's the most African-influenced place in the United States, and that there's the Sea Islands off the coast of Georgia, South Carolina, and it was the first place freed when the Civil War started, and the European planters fled the next day and left the day before enslaved people, so the culture, the language, the dialect, and all of this comes alive through the food. And like, that's what I learned. And the last thing I'll say is just yesterday I was teaching briefly at Zing Train, and to a group, and you know, one guy's like, I think he's also a history major, but he goes like, so how did your liberal arts like, do you think it actually helped you? And I was like, okay, in the last 4 weeks, like, I've written about John Trudell, who was very active in the American Indian movement, and very amazing poet and writer and whatever. And I wrote about Irina Ratushinskaya, who was a dissident Soviet poet, and I wrote about Peter Kropotkin, who wrote Mutual Aid in 1902. And I wrote an article about our history of Zingerman's through the lens of Jewish mysticism and how all this applies to business. So I'm like, what more do you want me to tell you?
So last question from me, but you know, you just spun us out into a ton of cultures there, Ari, right? But there's also there's sort of a Jewish origin story for Zingerman. So just because we do want to turn to questions, but, and by the way, Joan Nathan is giving an important lecture tomorrow evening, the Balin lecture at 6 p.m. In Rackham. And we'll send an email to everybody whose emails we have here, just to give you the link to that. You hear more about the sort of the Jewish story of this. So you each have kind of a different story. So I don't know if you want to give like a little intro. That is sort of, you know, we talked about your journey and how it came out of here, but how sort of Jewish identity has woven
It's
into
basically
that,
going to
but-
be how Judaism affected American food and how America affected Jewish food.
Right, and your role in that as well, right?
My moment.
Right, and so that's a long story, but clearly, you know, you've taken the Jewish identity piece and made our Jewish identities much richer.
I think that Ari just, what you said is probably exactly what I should have said about myself and liberal arts, because it does play out for sure in every single article that I write. I think constantly about the origins of the food, the origins of the people, and then do a little bit more work than just writing about people. And
Right, very much.
And I learned that here.
Yeah. You have told us, right, that your college experience you weren't thinking directly about Jewish things. You were studying many Jewish thinkers. 4 years later, you decide you're going to create Zingerman's.
No.
Oh.
4 years after I graduated.
Yeah, that's what I meant. 4
Oh,
years
sorry,
after you
yeah.
graduated, right? So, and it had you know, you were doing it with sort of through a Jewish.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Very.
lens, yeah.
Yes. The wrong story of our origin. Ted Owenby, who was the head of Southern Studies at Ole Miss, he told me origin stories are always disputed. So there's always different versions. The wrong story of Zingerman's origin is that Paul and I were college roommates, dreamed this up in our dorm room, graduated, and opened the deli. It's totally wrong. He's 5 years older than me. We didn't go to college together. He did go to U of M. We didn't know each other in college. And by the time we opened the deli, I don't know, he had like 8 years, and I had 4 years of work, working. I'm all back of the house, so it was never about the money. Because I was so I graduated. When I graduated, I didn't want to move home. In order to not move home, I needed a job. I'd driven a taxi part-time while I was in school. Many of you are old enough to remember it was the vets cabs, which were the blue and red ones, not yellow cab. And I didn't really like that much. It was fine, but not that interesting. One of my college roommates was waiting tables at Maud's, which many of you will remember, and I went in there and applied for that job that he had waiting tables. They said they'd call. I waited 2 weeks. They didn't call. I was like, uh-oh, I better go back. So I went back and reapplied as a busser, thinking I could get promoted later. Once again, they interviewed me and said they'd call. Once again, no call. So I was running out of money, and I went back a third time, which I now know is called emotional resilience. And I said, offered to do anything, and they said, "Do you want to wash dishes?" And never having worked in restaurants, I didn't know you weren't supposed to want to wash dishes. So I just said, "Sure, like whatever, I'll do anything." And so they said, "Do you want to start tomorrow?" I was like, "Great, I'll be there tomorrow." So that's how I started. I totally lucked out because I stumbled into work that I really love. There's a quote in the Managing Ourselves book from Paul Goodman, who is a good Jewish boy who actually did become a professor and an anarchist, that says, having a vocation is like falling in love and it works out. And it's awesome because we've all fallen in love with people and things and ideas and projects that didn't work out, far more of them in honesty that didn't work out for all of us. It's not a bad thing. But I got lucky because I stumbled into work that I really loved and then also into great people. So Paul Saginaw had grown up in Detroit, and he had come here and he had, what did he do? 1 year of hospital administration, zoology major thing. Anyway, he had quit school and went to work at Real Seafood Company, where he became the bar manager, and they promoted him to general manager at Maud's, and his first day was my first day, and that's how we met. And I'm talking really fast so we can get a lot in. Anyway, I prepped and line cooked and worked for them for 4 years. Paul left halfway through that and opened Monahan's in Carytown, which is still one of the best fish markets in the country for those who may not appreciate it. And then fall of 1981, I decided it was time to move on. I didn't hate working there, but it was less and less inspiring, and they didn't write a vision the way we do, but I could sense where they were going was not where I wanted to go, so I gave 2 months' notice. And then another great story that actually worked out, Paul called like 2 days later and said this building was coming open near the fish market, and we had talked off and on about doing a business together, which, as Ruth knows, in the food world, everybody talks about it, but hardly anybody ever actually does it. And another guy who, when I was speaking yesterday, said, how did you, what was it like to have the courage to open? And I'm like, I don't think I had that much courage. I already gave 2 months' notice. I was only 7 weeks away from being unemployed, and it seemed like a good thing to do. So somehow within like a week, we decided we would open, and somehow 4.5 months later, we had renovated the whole space, and we opened on March 15th, so 2 weeks ago was our 43rd anniversary. And it was Jewish stuff from the beginning. I mean, but it was never, much to my mother's dismay, it was very Jewish, but it was, we had ham hocks because it was the black middle class neighborhood, and we wanted to sell to the people who lived there. And we had prosciutto, wasn't very good compared to what we have now, but it was what you could get. So it was always a mix of things that I grew up on, chicken soup and chopped liver and corned beef, and then things that I never ate bacon until I was 21, but we had it, so.
Great, thank you. And Ruth, if you could share some of the thoughts you were sharing earlier about sort of Jews in the field that you ended up in as well. And
So I was asked to give a speech to a Jewish group, and they wanted stories of how my Judaism had really impacted my career. And I said to my lecture agent, I can't do that. And she said, well, you gotta think of something, because otherwise they don't, that's what anything. And I said, well, I could sort of talk about my Aunt Bertie and how she took me to Russ and Daughters when I was a kid. She said, fine, that'll do. And then I started thinking that at the point that I became the restaurant critic of the Los Angeles Times in 1984, every major restaurant critic in America was Jewish.
Yeah.
You know, in New York, you had Mimi Sheraton and Gail Green and Seymour Britchke and Arthur Schwartz and Jeffrey Steingarten. You had Phyllis Richmond in Washington, D.C., and on and on and on. And then I started thinking about sort of, well, let me take that back a bit. And I started thinking about the people who wrote about food in the New Yorker, the most important food people, right? A.J. Liebling, Joseph Vexberg, Bud Trillin, Jews. Then I started thinking about, Joan had told me that Proust actually never ate a Madeleine. His mother was Jewish, and what he ate was a Zwieback, a rusk. And, you know, I'm fascinated by that, and sort of fascinated about how he sort of, over the years, erased his Jewish background, and you can see it in the manuscripts if you look at them. And then I started thinking about who's probably the most important person in food writing in the last 100 years, Claude Lévi-Strauss. His grandfather was the rabbi at Versailles. Again, someone who erased his, you know, wasn't interested in being a Jew. But I started thinking about, you know, what does it mean that so many Jews were interested in food and food writing? And yeah, you can see, yeah, part of it comes out of the culture, but there's something really extraordinary if you think about, like, you know, 1970s, 1980s, you've got, you know, so many Jews and Jewish women particularly writing about food. And I realized that, you know, if you take my own experience, it was, I wanted to be a writer, and I was sort of looking around for a place where there was space for me to be a writer. And I grew up in a world where there was no such thing as a food writer. I mean, it wasn't a profession you'd even think about. And that's how we all got in, you know, because that space was open to us. And, you know, it's both women and Jews. And, you know, that space isn't open anymore. And so you are not seeing the day of the great Jewish food writer at this moment.
Today is, though, right here.
But, you know, for young people, it's totally different now. I mean, that space is very occupied. Other people want it. And I mean, I really, and so then I had to say to these people at this Jewish group I was speaking to, I thought that being Jewish had no impact on my being a food writer. And in retrospect, it has everything to do with how I became a food writer.
Perfect. All right, I know we have a super interested audience, and I want to invite questions at this point. We have about 20 minutes, I think. And the people with microphones, do you do that?
I can share. We're good sharers.
It's going to be tough.
Or we could repeat the question and then.
Yeah, we could do that too. Yeah.
No, thank you so much. Everything has been very interesting. This is very helpful, by the way, because I only have one hearing aid. The other one is stopped working. So this is very helpful. But the last thing you said triggered me in a way that you have to talk more about it, and that is, okay, it's open for women, it was open for Jewish people, okay, fine. Stories. And you guys have started with stories. You've both written, actually, Ari, I don't know if you've written a memoir of yourself, but I've read the other ones, and they're wonderful, but it's always the stories. So, Carla, you were pulling some stories out of them, but I want you to talk about the writing and the stories, not just about the food, but the stories around that food. And Ari was actually talking more about that.
Well, I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but I genuinely believe that I learned to write at the table, because I grew up in a household where when you sat down to dinner, you had to have a story. And what I learned was that every day, interesting things happened to you. And so I would come to the table with, maybe it was someone I met on the bus, maybe it was, going into the bakery that day, but that I had to have a story, and I had to, I would sit at the table thinking about, how do I begin it? Where's my lead? And so a big part for me of being a writer is knowing how to tell the story. And, what Ari certainly knows is that, the people who are great cheesemongers, great wine cellars, are the people who tell the stories. Tell the stories of the people who created that food. That is what's interesting. And when I was working at La Seine, two people trained me. One was this French woman, and one was this guy, a black man who had been a waiter for many years, named Henry. And Henry told me that my job as a waitress was to give the people a story to take home. He said, you can make it up if you want, but you send them home with more than just the food. You send them home with something to tell their friends about their dinner.
Well, I think all three of us have been lucky to meet people that have stories. And for me, I wrote my first cookbook in Jerusalem. It was really my first writing job. I was working for the mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, and I was his foreign press attaché. And I met people from all over the city. And I decided, I had this crazy idea, why don't I write a cookbook and have head notes, because they didn't have head notes in those days, about who these people were, and to introduce them, because I was learning all these stories, and I was watching them cook. And when you cook with somebody, and I know as a journalist, if I put down my pen, people start telling you a lot of stuff, really good stuff, and you better remember it. And so I wrote The Flavor of Jerusalem as a lark. It was turned down by 16 publishers, but it was full of stories, and I've been doing it ever since. And I guess that's what gave me the courage to finally, I guess at 27 years old or whatever I was, to do something like that. And I've written 12 books since then. But it's the stories that's what does it. And also and as you get older, and I was reading MFK Fish the other day, and I realized how she was able to integrate in her whole life all these different stories of, like chestnuts or whatever. And that's what we do. I think as we get older, we integrate stories about different foods, like what he's talking about, the sweet potatoes. I'm going there with Glenn Roberts in a few weeks. And, that's something I've really wanted to do, to go to South Carolina coast and meet these people. And so what I do is I take lots of notes. Not that I look at them, but at least I have the notes, or else I call them back, when I'm writing. And I too am always thinking about how am I going to begin it, what's the end going to be, you know, and that's what we do.
Stories. So it's all stories. We may not convey them well, but there's nothing without a story. I wrote a giant book on beliefs, not religion, but like what we believe about ourselves, about human beings, about race, religion, academia, books, food, and my belated understanding, which somehow I didn't understand until 10 or 11 years ago, that everything we do is based on what we believe, and that our beliefs are learned, not genetic, and that if they're learned, they can all be changed, and we're all living in this self-fulfilling belief cycle that is going on all day long. And 3 years ago, I met a guy who's become a good friend of mine, Gareth Higgins. He was just here. We co-taught 2 days at Zingtrain, and his work is all around stories, and I loved his books. And when I read his stuff, I'm like, whoa, stories are just beliefs made manifest. If you change the belief, you change the story. If you change the story, you change the belief. So it's all stories. And the work is, you know, whether it's writing or selling food or really anything, I mean, is to be able to tell the story in a way that's true, as Gareth would say, and also helpful. And part of the challenge that we face in the world today, I would say at large, is people telling stories that are not true and are not helpful. And that this is the challenge that we have, is to reclaim the truth.
Great. Questions?
And the stories.
Most hopeful thing I've heard in a long time, the idea that if it's belief, you can change it. Because
They
boy,
can
do
be
we need to
changed,
change it.
but here's the challenge that I learned, and I wrote a lot about it in the book, but you can't make anybody change their beliefs, and that's the problem. And people do change their beliefs, but the harder you try to make them, the deeper the roots go, and so that's part of the challenge.
And that's why it's important to try to listen and sit down together, and even if you don't agree with somebody, maybe you can change them if you really listen to them. It's hard. I mean, it's really hard right now, but I think that's what we have to do. And maybe over good soup or stew or whatever, it's Zingerman. No.
More soup.
You can do it.
Ask a question, you're going to get a great answer. Let's go.
I can tell a story.
Is there
Deborah, go ahead if you want. I'll just
All right, wait, is someone back there? Allie, someone? Oh, it's passing. Here we go.
While we're waiting, can I ask a question? Hi. Earlier you spoke about food as being something that can bring people together, but I've actually, among other Jews that I know, found food to be something that is quite isolating. I have several food allergies and other dietary restrictions. So my question is, how do you see the food world, Jewish or otherwise, evolving with the emergence of, or at least a heightened awareness of dietary restrictions?
Can I just add something to that, Haley? Because that's, for instance, in the Jewish community, kashrut laws can make it difficult. For instance, in Ann Arbor, when we try and have a very kosher event, it's that much. It's very difficult, and so it doesn't bring us together in this strange way. So,
Isn't that what those laws are supposed to do? Is set us apart? Well, no. I mean, that's what they're meant to do.
yeah, no, so what do you do with these?
Well, I think that from what I've read recently, and I just was at a kosher supermarket.
But also with
What can he?
yeah.
The amount of gluten-free. Look at all the matzahs that are out right now. All kinds of products are being produced in the kosher supermarkets, and of course a lot of them are with OU or whatever are for the general public in most supermarkets. because most products are kosher, not for the kosher necessarily, but they realize that it doesn't cost that much to do it, and it really expands. And from what I've read, I think the Pew thing, 1 out of 5 Jews is going to be Orthodox by the year 2040. So it's a little, well, because of their birth rates. I mean, it's a little, when you think about that 97% of Chabad are voted for Trump, for example.
Just on the other level, also that we're not going to get into that. So, but as Haley was raising the question, you know, these days you want to gather people and you say, and what are your food restrictions? And then you hear them, and you all know what to do with food, but it can be like, oh no, how am I going to bring people together? And there are a lot more products now.
But you can, but you can also have a lot of. You find out what your restrictions are, and then let's say you're going to do a salad or do vegetables. Just don't add the ingredients you can't use, but just people can put them on later. You know, yeah, I don't really worry about that when I invite people over. Sometimes people will bring their own food if they really have problems. But I try not to make them feel bad, or for me to change what I'm doing very much. Because you know, every Friday night I have people over that I'm home, and yeah, I never worry about that.
I mean, I think that's putting too much emphasis on the food and not enough emphasis on the meal. I mean, the idea of coming together to have a meal is to come together. And, you know, if we can't figure out how we can all gather around a table and be together to eat a meal, we are in trouble. I mean, I have people over all the time, and I just, you know, if they're vegan, I'll make a vegan meal, but I do not ask people, what are your food restrictions? And I figure that people will come, and they'll come for the company and come because it's going to be a good time. And if they need to bring their own food, they'll bring their own food. But, you know, for me, it is really about being together rather than eating together.
Well, I deal with this for a living, not in a bad way. Well, a couple things. I'm an introvert, so I don't go out, and we never have anyone over. So I don't have that problem. You know, from a business standpoint, I mean, there was a piece in the Times the other day, which I only skimmed, but it was like, restaurants don't want single diners anymore. And, you know, we opened with the very strong belief that it was our job to give the potential customers as many reasons to come as possible, and then to keep giving them great experiences, and then keep giving them more reasons to come, because we've always worked with the belief that nobody needs us. And I still get up with that belief every day. And so I'm going to say we don't care, but I don't mean we don't care about the person, but we don't care. Like, it's like, come have coffee and sit there for 2 hours. I don't care. I just want you to be there and feel welcomed and honored for who you are. And, you know, we don't get it perfect every day, but if we can create things that meet people's dietary needs, awesome. I feel lucky that they come and give us the chance to do that. And that's just what we do, you know. And then I'll just say, like, my sister, who's 2 years younger, is Orthodox. So we went to opposite ends of the continuum. But in terms of, so our daily lives around religion and eating are completely opposite, but our values, other than that, are very aligned. And I was just like, the real work is not the food. I wrote a whole pamphlet on dignity. And so, you could eat different food and still treat the person with dignity. You can go to a different place of worship and treat the person with dignity. That's the work. And so if we approach it with dignity and we never look down on anybody for what they eat or don't eat or don't do, it just would go better.
So this has been a wonderful panel, so thank you very, very much. This is actually mostly for the two women. I was curious whether you got involved at all with the nascent feminist movement, since you overlapped in times then. And there were consciousness-raising groups on campus and, various other things. And I don't know whether it touched you at all, but if it did, I'd be interested to hear.
Or even my earlier question about a sense of things changing in terms of the expectations for women on campus, or rules.
I never went to a consciousness-raising group, but I think I've always, since that 2 years old, did what I wanted to do. And so I just, I knew I wanted to, I didn't go on a program my junior year abroad, I just went. And, I didn't.
I never formally went to any kind of consciousness raising or feminist groups, but I would say that feminism had a huge impact on me. And just the notion that it was out there has pretty much shaped my life. It has been front and center for me really since I was 16 or 17.
Were you aware here of things?
I was
going
very
on?
aware of it, yeah. At the time, somehow civil rights seemed more important to me than feminism. I mean, the two things that really shaped my life here were civil rights and the anti-war movement. I mean, they were just...
Me too.
They were so powerful. But then when I sort of went off into the world, feminism really, you couldn't go into the world of work without really being aware of what your limitations were as a woman, what men were being offered that you weren't being offered, and it was just right there very sharply. And it's interesting when you talked about getting married and worrying about that. I never thought about it, honestly. I feel like I was extremely lucky that I'm just at the cusp of that.
Right.
Right before me, women came to school to get their MRS. I never once thought a man was going to support me.
I was thinking that if you had been here 10 years earlier, right, your expectations for yourself might have been quite different. Right?
Most everybody that I knew at Michigan got married right away, and never had a career. But
and when Doug and I got married, we were the only married people we knew for years.
That's 3 years apart, right? Right. So just to think about how culture was changing,
it's
right, all
yeah.
around you, yeah.
But I think I can thank my father for this. I just plowed ahead and did things, but of course I was happy that there was a women's movement. But I knew I would get less money, but I wasn't.
She was so adventurous. If you read her book, her memoir, she was so adventurous. She met so many interesting people. She was so brave in the world. It's really it's a wonderful memoir.
Anyway. Thank you.
So there's a lot to read. We have books out there we've out for sale by these authors. And there's a lot to eat. We have a Zingerman's Jewish dessert array.
You don't have to be Jewish to eat them. But I would.
Yeah, right. And we have a few closing thoughts. Yeah, totally. Good.
I just want you to know that through the years when I've been writing my books, I've come back to Michigan, and I know I have the mushroom barley soup and Jewish cooking in America, but I've watched Zingerman's grow, and also just the notion that Zingerman's started in Ann Arbor. You should be really applauding him. And it's just gone around the country, and I bet lots of people don't even think that the Zingerman's name is a Jewish name. If you just, it's good food.
Well, thank you. I was just, if you have 3 minutes, I just, Deborah's sitting right here, and I was just reflecting as we were sitting here that there's like 2 paragraphs out of this pamphlet that I wrote about Emma Goldman that sort of summarize the entire conversation from my end of it. And it's Jewish, not Jewish, but totally Jewish, and Zingerman's and not Zingerman's. So I wrote this for Emma Goldman's 150th birthday, whatever that was, 5 years ago. One day in 2008, while I was working on Zingerman's Guide to Good Leading, Part 1, which is a business book, I was asked to speak at the Jewish Studies Department at the university. The talk was scheduled for the following fall and was given the title Anarchism on Rye by a reference by Department Chair Deborah Dashmore, who's sitting up here if you can't see her, to my modern day work with the former and my 30 years ago academic interest in the latter. Busy as usual, I didn't think much about the topic at the time Dr. Dashmore invited me to speak. But over the course of the next summer, as the speaking date approached, I realized that although I had recently written an in-depth article on the history of Jewish rye bread, I hadn't looked at anything to do with Emma Goldman in ages. Not wanting to embarrass myself in front of the well-versed professors who I imagined would be in attendance, I dug out a stack of my old anarchist books and started to reread them. What I found threw me for quite an intellectual loop. The classic headline of anarchist activity, getting rid of government, was strongly present in what I was reading, but that's not what caught my attention. Government isn't something I have strong feelings about, which is sort of changing right now, one way or the other. Instead, I stumbled onto a treasure trove of creative concepts that sounded surprisingly similar to the progressive business literature I'd been reading so much over our then 26 years or so at Zingerman's. I did a bit of a mental double take, but sure enough, so many things that were integral to old anarchist thinking, mostly written by Jews, seemed to be embedded already in the way we worked at Zingerman's. The idea that a healthy organization exists to enhance the lives of the people who are part of it, that involving more people in managing the work they're doing makes good sense, that there's wisdom in everyone who works in an organization, that when men and women don't believe in the work they're doing, they don't do good work, that when human beings are treated like interchangeable machine parts, they'll never feel inspired to get to greatness, and that anyone, regardless of rank, can learn to lead. So all of that came out of going to school here. Because I wouldn't have studied it in the first place, because there wouldn't have been the Labadie collection. And most of the ones I was studying were Jewish, which I wasn't why I was studying them, but they were, to Ruth's point. And this whole connection came out of Deborah asking me to come speak to Jewish studies, and all of that work came out of that. So in a lot of ways, none of that was Jewish.
Thank you to all of you so much.